And can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
all's good. We're recording, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. So I'm Peg DeSanto, and I'm going to be talking about the vented hive versus the condensing hive, and then give an intro to the Hive Hugger insulation system that we developed, which did win the American Beekeeping Federation Award for Innovation last year. So, a little bit about me. I have been a registered nurse for 37 years, a beekeeper for 6. But it is my years as a nurse that did lay the foundation for why I'm here tonight talking about beehive insulation. I have worked in the ER, ICU, chemotherapy, and as a result, I have been intimately involved with hundreds of people as they fought for their lives. Maybe I was doing chest compressions on them or giving chemotherapy to a 4-year-old. And it's changed me. In the core of my being, I know how precious life is. Not just human life, all life. I haven't eaten meat for 14 years. And so imagine how I felt that first spring as a new beekeeper in Minnesota when I opened some of my hives and found tens of thousands of dead bees. I cried. I felt gut punched, right? I'm hardwired to save lives, so their deaths were on me. So in the following years, I tried multiple different winterization approaches. These are not my hives, but they could be because I tried many of these techniques, including straw bales. What strikes me most as I look at these photos is we beekeepers will go through great lengths to try to protect our bees in the winter. And we struggle with just how best to do this. So, despite trying a lot of different winterization techniques, I continue to lose about half of my hives every winter. And I learned I was not alone. According to the University of Minnesota, 50 to 60% colony loss is the average in northern climates. But something inside me said, can't we do better by our bees? I mentioned someone's wanting to enter the waiting room here. I'm going to admit them. So I thought, can't we do better by our bees? And as serendipity would have it, around this time, I started dating a man who owns a business in high-tech insulation. So I thought, okay, that's maybe destiny. So together we paired up and set out to develop the most effective winterization system ever made. I mentioned I was a nurse in the intensive care unit, but I was also the instructor, where I would teach nurses how to care for these extremely complex, critically ill patients. And everything we do in medicine to save lives is based in science. So as we started this quest to save honeybee lives, to me, it was very important that it was also based in science. Being I'm from Minnesota, the first stop was the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. When I asked for advice on where to get started with this goal, they actually said, look into the research by Bill Heschbeck. Curiously, Bill is kind of known as the godfather of condensing hives. A few years ago, he wrote an article in Bee Culture on winter management. So I reached out to Bill. He's become a good friend and a mentor of mine. He's used our product 3 years in a row now, testing it, gives it 2 thumbs up. But besides Bill Heschbeck, I've gotten to know Etienne Tardif, Randy Oliver, the research by Derek Mitchell, Tom Seeley, did a really deep dive into the scientific research on how best to winterize our bees. And I was very impressed that the research is plentiful, it's consistent in its recommendations, it's current, and it's gotten quite high tech. For example, we have access to things like infrared thermal imaging, where now we can sort of take a peek inside of the beehive, see where there's areas of heat loss, where the cluster is, how big it is. technology that we didn't have years ago that can inform us on what's going on inside our hive in the winter. And then there's the whole world of sensors. These green rectangles can give you the temperature and relative humidity in your hive every 10 minutes. And one researcher in particular that I want to sort of call out is Etienne Tardif. He's a beekeeper, engineer, researcher, and he's very well known. He speaks at all the big conferences on overwintering bees, and he's located in the Yukon. So what Etienne will do, he will put like 20 sensors, this is one of his photos, in a single hive. And then he'll just switch out the winterization system. Insulate, don't insulate, ventilate, don't ventilate, even to the detail of switching the size of the ventilation hole. And a result of this research, he literally now has millions of data points. This slide is one of his. It's a cross-section of one of his beehives. So you can see literally every inch, he can tell you the temperature and relative humidity in the hive. If there's ventilation channels, where the cluster is, how big is it moving. So with access to this sort of technology, it's no longer a mystery what's happening thermodynamically inside the hive. And so based on the research, they come up with clear recommendations on optimal ways to overwinter. And so based on that, we just developed a system based on what research says you should do. So that the system is very much data-driven. And before I kind of go into the nuts and bolts that informed the design of the product, I do want to be sort of the first to say that of this, 50 to 60% winter colony loss, only a percentage of that is probably due to inadequate, protection against cold or mismanagement of moisture in the hive. Clearly, there's all these other factors that contribute to winter colony loss. But we thought, if we could put a dent in this percent by really coming up with a solution to this part, it was worth a try. So as I delved into the research, the biggest, and excuse my pun, most heated debate out there is, what's the bigger cause of winter mortality? Like, what's killing our bees in the winter? Is it the moisture, wet bees, or is it the cold? And if I were to survey you all, my guess is there'd be about a 50-50 split. And you would all be right, because according to the scientific literature, it's both. And we needed to solve for both. How to solve for both? In order to sort of explain the thermodynamics, I found using a relatable life example is the easiest way to do that. So let's all pretend we're going to take a road trip to the Yukon in January. So we all pile in the bus. It's a long drive, so we're talking a lot about beekeeping. And so as a result, there's a lot of hot air in the bus. Pretty soon, condensation starts to form on the windows. And it's so much like we can't see outside anymore. Side question, what is the temperature of the window for condensation to be occurring? Well, the answer is dew point. And this is a very important term to remember for later. As we're all sitting here digesting our supper, a byproduct of our metabolism is actually water vapor. And when that water vapor hits a surface in the room, might be like a can of pop, when water vapor hits a surface in the room cold enough to be at dew point, water vapor turns into liquid water and thus condensation forms. So back to the bus. What do we do about this condensation? How do we get rid of it? Because we can't see, the bus driver can't see. Well, we ventilate, right? Heat cranks on the vent, brings in recycled air or fresh air. Fresh air, right? We crack the windows. So that warm, moist air gets replaced by cold, dry air. Condensation clears up, and we can see. life is good. But after a while, what's happening in the bus? Right? It's getting cold. So let's bring this into a beehive. Like humans, a byproduct of the bee's metabolism is also water vapor. According to Randy Oliver, for every pound of honey the bees eat, they will produce 1.25 cups of water. And a percentage of that is actually in water vapor. So, like in the bus, in the beehive, as that water vapor starts hitting surfaces in the hive that are at the dew point, that water vapor is going to turn into liquid water. And if that's the ceiling of the hive and that water drips down on our bees, wet bees are dead bees. So, moisture problem. What do a lot of beekeepers do to solve for the moisture problem? Well, like on the bus, they ventilate. They might drill holes in the hive boxes. They might put on a quilt box with holes in it. But according to Derek Mitchell, he has this PhD in thermal fluids at Leeds University, and this diagram was taken out of this article in American Bee Journal. What happens when we put upper entrances in our beehives? Cold, dry air comes in the lower entrance and literally pushes up and out this warm, moist air. So yes, it solves for the moisture problem, but what leaves with it? Heat, right? Precious heat. So you just get this constant, continual flow of heat loss out of your hive. Well, is that a problem? You know, in the bus, it's not. We have a gas-powered engine. We can just crank the heat. But in a beehive, right, the bees are the gas. And according to the research, when we kind of put our bees into this like heating response, they can literally work themselves to death. Etienne calls it metabolic stress can lead to metabolic death. So at a certain temperature, the bees go into a cluster, queen is in the middle, and then these heater bees vibrate their wing muscles to generate heat. But according to Bill Heschbeck, in non-insulated ventilated hives, the bees have to put forth an extraordinary amount of effort to keep the colony alive all winter. And they will pay for it by dying earlier in the spring. So according to the research, this is very hard on our bees. And probably the most interesting thing I learned going through the research comes from Derek Mitchell's work. He says the cluster is a survival mechanism we beekeepers impose upon the bees, that in very well insulated colonies, they don't cluster at all. Etienne, who's in the Yukon, says that in his well-insulated, non-ventilated hives, the bees' resting metabolism is enough to maintain their internal environment, which means, again, humans, all living animals, as they're just living life, we put out a certain amount of heat. And Etienne says that's all the heat the bees need in his colonies to survive. And that, so this is a picture of Etienne's colonies in winter. They're not clustering at all. They're just loosey-goose kind of roaming around the colony, unclustered. So very important implications of the research. I want to just do a little bit deeper dive into this clustering behavior. And I want to just highlight a research study that was done in Australia. I'm going to orient you to this graph. So along the lower axis is temperature in Celsius. So I gave you the Fahrenheit conversions. And then this vertical axis is metabolic rate of the bee. Like, how hard are they working? So I want to just draw your attention to at about 60 degrees. You can see that there's a very clear split in the axis of this line. So let's just follow what happens to the bee as the temperatures drop less than 60 degrees. you can see the metabolic rate of the bee goes up very quickly and exponentially. This is only 60 to 50 degrees. Imagine 2 degrees or minus 10. So once the temperatures drop below 60, your bees are working hard. Contrast that to warmer than 60. Yeah, I mean, 60 to 86, there's some increase in metabolic demand. They're probably a little bit more active, but negligible. So Etienne's research says at about 50 to 55 degrees, the bees start to cluster, vibrate their wing muscles to generate heat. This high metabolic demand state leads to increased honey consumption. Makes sense, right? They're working hard. They need energy to work that hard. So energy comes in the form of food. They're going to eat a lot more honey the harder they're working. Contrast that to when your bees are warmer than 60, not clustering, low honey consumption. So I'll be bringing up this 60-degree temperature a little bit later, looking at some more data, but it's an important number to like memorize. So besides learning that at 50 to 55 degrees, they start to cluster and vibrate their wing muscles, at about 14 degrees, that cluster is at its tightest. Like it can't get any tighter. So if the cold threat persists, this outer layer of bees will just go into a chill coma and drop off the cluster until you just have a pile of dead bees at the bottom of your hive. Or freezing to death might look like they're in a super tight cluster and they can't even move an inch away from their honey. And you might think, oh, well, they starve to death. No, that's not accurate. In those situations, they froze to death because they were too cold to move even an inch to get their honey. Starving to death, however, is also a common outcome of cold bees. But what that looks like is your bees are working so hard to generate heat that they will consume all the honey you left them for the winter, and then they'll starve to death. And with all that honey consumption comes increased water consumption because they need it to dilute their honey. And with limited opportunities for cleansing flights, they risk dysentery and spreading nosema. So just this negative cascade of effects when you ventilate and have your bees exposed to cold. Another piece of data, this was just done last year. The USDA did this research study. It was published in Bee Culture this year. And it said cold bees have weaker immune systems too, which would make sense. They say that increased energy the overwintering bees need to maintain their hive temperature takes away from energy available from immune function, which leaves them more susceptible to diseases, infection, and higher winter colony losses. So again, that metabolic stress does kill our bees, not only just from the stress, but they get sicker too. And so, yeah, your bees in poorly insulated hives can make it through winter, but at what cost? Another detrimental effect of cold on bees is something I've learned a lot of beekeepers don't know about, and it actually happens in the spring. The spring is the highest season for mortality, curiously. And what happens at that time of year is the queen starts laying eggs. And when brood is present, these old, and I say old because these winter bees are pushing 200 days old. They're old, and if they were cold, they're tired. So old, tired winter bees now have to activate their glands and take care of baby bees and heat the brood to 95 degrees. And if there's a cold snap and they aren't protected very well and they can't maintain that brood zone, they'll just quit trying. And without replacement brood, the whole colony will perish. And so it's a really frustrated time for beekeepers, like, oh, they made it through February and now they up and died in March. This is why. And I'll take a minute just to explain this colorful, busy graph. The bottom axis is the date. The vertical axis is the temperature inside the beehive. With the exception of this blue slash line, this is the outside ambient temperature. And each of these squiggly lines is a separate beehive. Remember those green rectangles? Each hive has one of these sensors in it to tell us the temperature in the hive. So let's just look, say here we have end of February. You know, all our temperatures are sort of all over the place. But look what happens on about March 11th. A fair number of the colonies committed to raising brood on this date. See, like how these are no matter what, the temperature is staying in the brood zone. These haven't committed yet, not sure why. But yeah, back here in February, nobody was hanging out in the brood zone. Here, it looks like a couple are experimenting with it. And so this is what it looks like. I mean, no, here at outside ambient temperature, it's 10 degrees out. And they are working hard to keep it at 95 degrees. Where, you know, back here when it's 10 degrees out, oh, it's perfectly fine if the hive is not nearly at those temperatures. It's not required to work that hard to bring the temp this high. It is when brood is present. So if you insulate your hives, don't be in a rush to take the insulation off in the spring. Very vulnerable time thermodynamically for your hive. The last detrimental effect of cold and ventilating, and frankly, using a lot of moisture absorbing materials in your colony, is your bees are at risk for literally life-threatening dehydration. There's reports of bees like flying out of the hive with a desperate attempt to bring back water because they need water in the hive. It's used to consume honey and to remain hydrated. And so, you know, things that a lot of beekeepers don't know about. So another detrimental effect of these practices. So the research shows, yes, venting gets rid of moisture, but in doing so, it actually hurts our bees because it gets rid of precious water and then leads to life-threatening cold exposure. And it looks like the bees agree. Lots of reports of them propylizing up these upper entrances. This is an Apimaye hive vent. So venting our hives does not solve for both. So the question many people have at this juncture is, well, without venting our hives, how do we manage the moisture? Oh, let me just see who's in the chat. Oh, I've seen my vents propylized. So without venting, how do we manage moisture in the hive? The answer is actually, it might be a surprise, it's insulate, but in a very specific way. The key is you super insulate the top of the hive to keep it above dew point. You also insulate the side walls, but not as much, so that when condensation does occur in the hive, because it will, because we want it to, the condensation will occur on the cooler walls. And remember, in a well-insulated hive, the bees aren't clustering, so they're free to walk over to the sidewalls and drink the water that's condensing there. So again, the key to solving for both, super insulate the top of the hive, keep it above dew point because it's staying super warm, never allowed to hit dew point, and then you insulate less on the sidewalls so they are allowed to hit dew point, so the moisture condenses on the sidewalls. So that's the basic principles of a condensing hive, and it solves for both. This little experiment was done by John Gott. He's a master beekeeper out east, and this was published in American Bee Journal. And what John did is he took some of his hives, put a clear plexiglass panel on them, and then top insulated some of them and then not others. And then at some point in the winter, he took off the outer cover and took photos of the plexiglass. The colony on the left is one with good top insulation, and you can see literally very little to no condensation, except on the periphery where the bees aren't harmed by it, versus the top, the hive without top insulation, full of condensation. This is just a real short video done by the same beekeeper, John Gott. It's just showing the bees drinking the water that condenses on the edges.
This bee is drinking some of the condensate from the edge of this hive, which is probably a water bottle bee. These bees will store the water and use it as needed in the cluster, probably mostly to thin the honey, so it can be consumed by the other bees. This is a clear inner cover without a vent. Two temperature sensors in here. One's measuring both the temperature and the humidity, and the other's just the temperature.
Okay. This is another little video excerpt from one of Randy Oliver's talks. I know I mentioned earlier, but Randy is really a world famous scientific researcher on really anything related to bees. But this is what he has to say about upper entrances and venting our hives.
Yes, go ahead. Randy, you made the comment that top entrances might not have value.
Yeah.
Why would you say that?
Because looking at all the research, there's very few places in the world where there's been any findings that suggest they actually do have a value. When you put a top entrance and a bottom entrance in, that's like imagine you live in a 2-story house during winter. Don't take my word for this. Try this, okay? Is it cold at your area now?
Yes.
Okay, so turn off the heater, open the front door, and open the top window, and see how it feels living in that house.
What about the moisture content? How's the condensation getting out of the hive?
So there's no reason for condensation if the hive is insulated enough. So generally, top insulation will put the condensation to the outside of the hive, to the where it reaches dew point temperature. That's the moisture the bees need in order to have enough moisture during the winter.
All right. I figured if Randy Oliver says it, you'll believe him probably more than me. But he summed it up in one sentence, which took me 20 minutes. So, all right. So the key to solving for both is insulate, but how much? And so before I talk about quantifying insulation in the beehive, I want to just explain how it's even measured. And so it's measured in something called R value. R stands for resistance. How much resistance does a material offer against heat loss? And the R value compares an inch of one material against an inch of another material. And here's some common beehive insulation R values of materials. Tar paper, 0. Wood chip, sawdust, straw, snow, 1 to 2. Cardboard, fiberglass, 3 to 4. And you might be thinking, oh, cardboard is a R 3 to 4. That's pretty good. But this would be an inch of cardboard, remember, not just a single ply. And then lastly, we have foam boards at a 4 to 5. So one research study that I want to share looked at non-insulated hives with insulated hives. And this was done in a little bit warmer climate zone, but it's done by the University of Illinois. And they basically looked at insulated hives versus non-insulated hives. And they looked at 3 different things to measure. The first one was overall colony survival. The insulated hives had a 22.5% improvement in overall colony survival. So remember when I said that 55%, we could probably put a good dent in it by having a good winterization approach. That this study showed, yes, that's true. Also, the insulated hives had a 2-fold reduction in just bee population decline. So if the colonies made it, the insulated colonies had much stronger colonies coming into spring. And then the insulated hives also consume significantly less honey, and we know why. Another research study that looked at insulating versus, or just how much to insulate, there's actually 2 studies. The first one, both were done by Dr. Tom Seeley, who's a PhD professor of biology at Cornell. You've probably heard of him. He's very well published, very well-known speaker. But in 1976, Seeley and Morse asked the question, you know, bees have survived for a long time in nature, in natural tree cavities. So what are the qualities of a natural tree cavity in which, you know, their survival is optimized, or they're choosing their homes? And so what they found is that in a natural tree cavity, above the colony is sort of infinite amount of insulation, like many, many feet of wood. So again, kind of this idea of super top insulate above the colony. And then the walls, they liked trees that were alive, but interesting, the walls were very thick. And they did not have upper entrances. They chose enclosures with just lower entrances. So curiously, natural tree cavities are condensing hives. Just in 2022, this time it was Radcliffe and Seeley, took this original research study to kind of another level. They said, okay, well, these are sort of the general qualities of natural tree cavities, but if we were to say, hey, beekeepers, to make your Langstroth hive much closer to the natural home of a honeybee, how much insulation would you need to provide for them? And they actually came up with numbers. Their research study said we should be providing R30 on the ceiling and R7 on the 10 wall on the wall. I'm sorry, R10 on the walls. And again, their research said confirmed no ventilating, no upper entrances. At least in Minnesota, with new construction building code, the R values for attics is 49. So if that gives you a reference on how much insulation is R30, you know, it's not as much as we put in our houses, but so now we've got some numbers to give us guidelines on how much we should be insulating. And then again, I mentioned research done by Etienne Tardif. But he in the Yukon gets 90 to 100% survival, which tells you something. And this is one of his slides that gives sort of his overall principles on how he keeps his hives hot in the winter. No upper vents. R30 above the hive, top insulation. He mentions using a condensing wall on purpose, so condensing hive. And again, like the Seeley study, but he uses R10 to 20. So similar numbers. And so based on, you know, the research for climate zones 1 through 5, Etienne's 1 to 2, the Seeley study was done in zone 5, and they came up with similar recommendations. Here in Minnesota, we're at 3-4. So the product we designed really is recommended for kind of zones 1 through 5. You know, if people are down here in these warmer climate zones, you may not need that much. And, you know, we can talk about that, but we're really trying to hit the northern climates for winter protection. So I talked a lot about the science behind a condensing hive, but I wanted you to, not just say, hey, there's this product and you should do it this way without understanding the science behind it, because it's a pretty big paradigm shift. A lot of beekeepers, because I've been, talking to beekeepers all over the country, ventilating is a pretty common practice. So I wouldn't expect you to adopt a new practice without understanding why. So that was sort of the science behind the design. In the next part of the talk, I'm going to just talk somewhat briefly about the product itself. And it's basically two components. We have the top panel and then a side wrap. So the top panel, and this is where the partner came into play. The top panel is known as a vacuum insulation panel. And they're very, very high tech, like you can't get them at Home Depot, a very high specialty item. These panels have the highest R value, and so they're most effective insulation ever created. An inch of a vacuum panel is a 46. Remember, foam board was the highest we saw on the other chart. This is 10 times more efficient than foam board. And the reason for that is that in a vacuum, no air molecules exist. And without air molecules, like heat loss, heat transfer, is extremely slowed down. So if you think of like thermoses are vacuum insulated, containers. So some brilliant person said, well, wow, if vacuums are super great insulators, why don't we develop an insulation panel that's actually a vacuum? And so that's what they did. Besides being 10 times more efficient than other insulation materials, refrigerators who use these will use like 50% less energy. So probably your refrigerator has these vacuum insulation panels. They're often used in shipping containers because it can keep cargo at a constant temperature for like 5 days. If not punctured, these panels have a service life for up to 50 years. And Yeti they are putting vacuum insulation panels in their coolers. If you're wondering why they are so much superior than other coolers, it's because of this technology. Does the world need an $800 cooler, vacuum insulated? Well, yeah, Yeti says yes. And they're very popular because they work. And so now they've made it to the bee industry. So the panel we had specifically made for the beehive, we didn't need an R46. So we really it's not an inch. An inch would be 46. So this is about 3/4 of an inch to get about the R30 that we are shooting for. And so besides, wanting to keep it above dew point, I do want to mention 75% out of the heat loss is out of the top of the hive. So if you're going to insulate one place in your hive, it should be the top. A lot of products just focus on the side wrap, but this is where you really want your hive protection. And it's custom cut to fit flush with the wooden inner cover. So it's obviously very easy to install. And this year, we actually made a panel. You probably see the sticker. It says the crown. We call this vacuum panel the crown because it's shiny, sits on top of the hive, honor the queen bee. But this is a way to convert apame hives to condensing hives, because underneath this Reflectix is a plexiglass panel, seals the heat and makes the airtight containment in the colony. And then the high R value panel, and then the lid on top of that. And these crown panels can also be used for the top bar in the Layens hive to convert those to condensing hives. And so, obviously they're compact. Here's 3 crown panels compared to the equivalent in foam board. They're mouse and ant proof. And they're eco-friendly. There's nothing toxic in these vacuum insulation panels. But I do want to just mention that even though these are efficient, you don't need them to create a condensing hive. Makes it easy, but I want to just share how to do a DIY. This beekeeper was in Spain. I did this YouTube of the video I'm giving you now, the talk, and it went kind of viral. It got like 20,000 views and kind of all over the world. But so we don't sell overseas. So he's sent me very proudly this photo of his condensing hive. And this is what Etienne does in the Yukon. He uses poly hives, and then he puts an empty hive box on top of his one inner cover, and then just stacks like 6 to 8 inches of foam board in an empty hive box. And then obviously puts on the wrap in addition to his poly hives. And this beekeeper's mom has alpaca. So she was going to put a couple medium supers on top of her hive to get the condensing high R value up there. And then just no upper entrance. So it's very simple. If you know the principles, you can easily do a DIY. And on my deathbed, I will be most proud if I help create the paradigm shift and get the education out there than selling product. In fact, last year, a beekeeper reached out to me this spring and he said, Peggy, 18 of my 18 colonies made it. Thank you so much. And I said, oh, I'm glad you love the product. And he said, well, no, I didn't buy anything from you, but I did this. And he had really just super great outcomes. So I couldn't be happier about that. So that's all about the top panel. And next, I'm going to just talk about the side wrap. This is just off the shelf Home Depot. I mean, we don't get it at Home Depot, but 1.5 inch polystyrene foam board. And we have 2 different densities that you can choose from, which would standard density or high density would give it an R7 to 8. You add the wooden hive box, which is an R1. So we're getting 8 to 9 for the sidewalls, which is close to the 10 recommended by research. But what's really nice about our wrap is the corners are water jet cut professionally. So they're really easy to sort of put together like puzzle pieces to assemble and disassemble and stack for storage. We also have foam boards that can go around a top bar hive. Here's the crown panels that fit on top, so you can make your top bar hive into a condensing hive. This isn't necessarily exactly about the product itself, other than this is where I tell you that it only comes in the biggest size is a double deep, and that's data driven. And the reason for that is too big of a hive box overwintering configuration can be very detrimental to the bees. And I would maybe challenge people who feel like they need to overwinter in more than a double deep or, certainly triple deeps. Etienne, these are his statements. He says, choosing the right size hive box is critical. If the amount of bees to the volume of hive box space, he says it's critical that if there are too few bees in too large a volume, it will result in winter failure. So it's recommended you sort of assess how big your colony is going into fall, and then you overwinter in the hive box size that matches your colony size. And a research study actually done in Egypt looked at colony survival based on how big a hive box size they overwintered in. And the hive temperatures were the warmest. There was the most honey, pollen, and brood was achieved by using the smallest internal beehive size. So, I mean, if you think about it, do you want your bees to try to manage thermodynamically like a 3-story mansion or just a tiny bungalow? So try to overwinter in the smallest hive box size possible. So again, that's a little bit about the product is a double deep is the biggest it comes in for this reason. So that's really all I wanted to share about the product. I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about the research we specifically have done on the product. This is the first year of testing, and these are not my colonies. These are actually a friend of mine that does cutouts in Wisconsin. And just to orient you again, this is the date, temperature inside the hive. This time the pink slash line is outside ambient temperature. And again, all these other squiggly lines are individual hives. And the two top hives are hive hugger hives. The rest of these colonies are his, but they curiously are also insulated, and they are also condensing hives. This beekeeper has been running condensing hives for a long, long time. He knows the research, but he insulates with an R10 on the ceiling and an R5 on the sidewalls. So I just want to show you why the research says you need an R30, because here's his hives, here's hive hugger hives. Remember earlier in the talk when I talked about at 60 degrees, less than 60, the bees get kicked into the clustering, shivering response, high metabolic demand, high honey consumption. Even though his hives are insulated, they are running around 50 degrees. So they're still in survival response. Versus you put an R30 on top, here's 75 degrees. So clearly running, I mean, here it gets to be, this is below zero. They're still, I'd say, probably over 60. And so this beekeeper weighs his colonies in the fall, and then he weighs them in the spring to assess honey consumption. He called me in the spring and he said, Peg, your hive hugger hives consumed 50% less honey than the rest of his colonies. And now we know why. Survival clustering and not. And so, yeah, I guess the data is proven right here, or it backs up what the data says of why an R30 is important. So remember I said I started out this quest going to the University of Minnesota for help. So once the design was created and we got some preliminary data, I went back and shared, with them kind of what we had come up with. And very supportive, Marla Spivak sitting next to me, Gary Reuter, Katie Lee were there. And they said, get more data. And they told me about a SARE grant, wrote a letter of recommendation, and we got it. And so the following year, we did a study where we looked at common products for overwintering, Bee Cozy, Reflectix, and tar paper. But all of these other systems were ventilated because that's how they're designed. And so now you kind of know how to look at Broodminder. These top two are hive hugger hives, and these are all the other winterization systems. And curiously, here's the pink outside ambient temperature. There's not a significant difference. But because remember, think about it. You've got an upper entrances, so you've got this constant source of heat loss. And so this doesn't appear to be doing that much more. So just more data. And the other curious one that maybe not surprising is besides less honey consumption, the hive hugger hives have much stronger spring colonies and much earlier brooding. The queen looks for this, it's called flatlining. She has more confidence starting to raise brood with constant and reliable hive temperatures. So in summary, I just want to say that the scientific literature, as well as our own research, very much shows that well-insulated condensing winter setups are better as far as mortality, stronger spring colonies, queen starts laying earlier, less honey consumption, and then the bees have access to the much needed water. So I do have a couple pages of references if you all want to read about some of the research studies that inform the design. And then lastly, I want to just share that last year was the first year of selling the product, and we sold about 1,200. and it's all over the country. I was surprised beekeepers from Texas are like, oh, it snowed here. And they just want peace of mind with some erratic weather patterns that their bees are protected. But we got a lot of good feedback from beekeepers, and the majority of our sales this year are return customers. So this is our website. If you have any questions, you can also email me. Here's my email address. My phone number is on the website if you want to call. Happy to answer questions that way. But I do want to say I'm still working as a nurse. Hopefully someday I can retire from that and do this business full time because I love it. And I do want to share that that little boy in the beginning was one of my chemotherapy patients who had metastatic liver cancer. And he's still living. He beat the odds. He's doing well. And so I just want to close with saying that life is precious. And so take good care of yourselves and your loved ones, because it matters. So with that, I'll open it up to questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, thank you for having me. It was really nice to be able to share and talk with you all.